All right, listeners, ready for this? You send us some research, and well, it's about a huge experiment they did in the Dominican Republic. It's about taxes, but get this, they mixed in behavioral economics and nudges.
You know what's really interesting is this is one of the first studies to try this kind of thing in the Dominican Republic.
Yeah, so we're going to dive deep into that today. But before we do, let's bring in our expert. Welcome to the show.
Glad to be here.
Okay, so this study was led by Marvin Cardoza from the Dominican Republic's Tax Administration. But he had some help, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely. He had a whole team of academics with him, John List and Justin Holtz from the University of Chicago,
Okay.
Alejandro Zentner from the University of Texas at Dallas, and Joaquin Zentner from the Inter-American Development Bank.
Wow, so they had quite the team assembled. But before we get into their experiment, can you give us some context? Like, what's the tax situation in the Dominican Republic? Why was this study even necessary?
Well, the Dominican Republic has a big problem with tax evasion, especially when it comes to corporate income tax. Their tax to GDP ratio is much lower than in developed countries.
Hmm.
And in 2017, get this, an estimated 61.8% of corporate income tax was just never paid.
Wow, that's a lot of money.
Yeah, it is. And historically, tax enforcement in the Dominican Republic has been pretty lax.
Okay.
But then in 2018, they passed a new law that really changed things.
Oh, how so?
This new law brought in some much stricter penalties for tax evasion, like they even added the possibility of prison sentences.
Wow, prison. So this new law really sets the scene for this nudge experiment. It seems like they were trying to tackle the problem from two sides, tougher enforcement, and then also these behavioral interventions.
Exactly, and the study was designed to see how effective these nudges would be, especially with these new stricter penalties in place.
All right, so let's get into the experiment itself. What did they actually do? I'm guessing they didn't just send a letter to every company saying, pay your taxes or else.
Haha, no, it was a lot more nuanced than that. They worked with over 56,000 firms and randomly assigned them to 6 different groups. One was the control group. They just got a normal reminder about the tax deadline.
Okay, makes sense.
But the other 5 groups, each of them got different messages, all designed to nudge them toward compliance.
Okay, now this is what I'm talking about. What kind of nudges are we talking about here?
Well, some of the messages reminded the firms about the potential consequences of evading taxes.
Like the prison sentences?
Exactly. Others emphasized that any punishment would be made public.
Ooh, yeah, that would be bad for business.
Right. Imagine your company's name all over the news for not paying taxes.
Yeah, that would be a PR nightmare.
It would. They also use something called commission framing.
Commission framing, what is that?
So instead of saying like, oops, we forgot to report this income,
Right.
the messages made it sound like we actively chose to hide this income.
Oh, interesting. So it's about highlighting the intentionality of it.
Exactly. It makes it much harder to play the innocent mistake card.
I see. So they sent out all these messages, but did they actually work? Did they have a measurable impact?
Oh yeah, the results were really impressive. Overall, the experiment led to a significant increase in tax revenue, about $184 million.
Wow. That's a lot of money.
It is. And that represents about 0.22% of the Dominican Republic's entire GDP in 2018.
So just by sending a few well-crafted letters, they were able to boost tax revenue by a considerable amount.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable.
And which messages were the most effective?
Both the prison and public disclosure messages had a positive impact. But you know what the most effective ones were?
The prison ones.
You got it. Especially when they were combined with that commission framing. Seems like people really don't want to go to jail. And highlighting the fact that tax evasion is a choice really made them think twice.
That makes sense. No one wants to be a criminal. But did they see any changes in behavior? Was it just about scaring people into paying more, or were people actually reporting their income more honestly?
They actually saw both. One of the key findings is that fewer firms tried to claim exempt income levels after getting these nudges. So it seems like they were reporting their earnings more accurately, knowing that the scrutiny was higher.
Okay, so it wasn't just about fear. It seems like the nudges actually made people more honest. But what about the big companies? Did they respond to these nudges? Or were they too sophisticated to be swayed by a letter?
Well, that's what's so surprising about the study. The large firms were actually highly responsive to the nudges. And they ended up accounting for the majority of that extra tax revenue that was generated.
Hold on. Really, that's not what I would have expected. You'd think these big corporations with all their lawyers and accountants would be able to just ignore these nudges. What's going on there?
Yeah, it is kind of surprising. It seems that even these big sophisticated corporations can be influenced by these behavioral interventions. You know, one possible explanation is that maybe larger firms are actually more sensitive to the risks involved.
You mean like more worried about fines or penalties?
Yeah, that's part of it, but it's also about protecting their reputation.
Oh, right. Big companies have a lot more to lose in terms of their image. They don't want to be seen as tax cheats.
Exactly. The thought of being publicly shamed for tax evasion can be a really powerful deterrent, especially for companies that rely on things like consumer trust and brand loyalty.
Okay, so it's not just about the money. It's about protecting their brand. I get it. But I'm curious about what these nudges actually looked like. Were they like long legal documents or something more subtle?
Actually, they were pretty simple and straightforward. Like, the control group just got a basic reminder.
What did that say?
Something like just a friendly reminder that your tax filing deadline is approaching. Please ensure timely submission to avoid any penalties.
Okay, so pretty standard stuff. How did they change it for the treatment groups?
Well, for the groups that were getting the prison-focused messages, they just added a line at the end.
Like what?
It said failure to comply with tax regulations, including accurate reporting of income, may result in significant penalties, including imprisonment under the new law.
To the point. What about the public disclosure messages? How did they word those?
Those ones said something like, any penalties imposed for tax evasion will be made public, ensuring transparency and accountability within the tax system.
So basically they were saying, we're going to put your name on blast if you don't pay your taxes.
Pretty much. And then for the commission framing messages,
Yeah, the ones that made it sound like they were choosing to evade taxes.
right, they just added a phrase to the standard reminder emphasizing the importance of accurately and honestly reporting all income, as any discrepancies may be interpreted as intentional misreporting.
Got it. So it's all about shifting the blame from an honest mistake to a deliberate choice. That's clever. Did they look at the results by company size? Like, did bigger companies respond differently to the nudges than smaller companies?
Yeah, they did. They broke the data down by the number of employees. And it's pretty interesting. So, like we said, the large firms overall were very responsive to the nudges. But the biggest firms, they were the most responsive to the prison messages.
Wow, so the bigger they are, the harder they fall. Huh. That's interesting. I guess it just goes to show that even big corporations can be influenced by these behavioral interventions.
It does, and it really highlights how important it is to understand the psychology of the groups you're trying to influence. In this case, it seems like the potential for personal consequences and reputational damage was a huge motivator for these big companies.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if governments could be doing more to use these kinds of nudges to improve tax compliance. If they can get big corporations to pay their fair share, imagine how much extra revenue they could generate.
Definitely. This study really opens up new possibilities for tax policy. Maybe it's time to start thinking about behavioral interventions alongside traditional enforcement methods.
Yeah, it's like instead of just punishing people for doing the wrong thing, what if we could nudge them towards doing the right thing in the first place?
Exactly. But if this approach works so well for taxes, do you think it could be applied to other areas too?
Like what?
I don't know. Could we use nudges to encourage people to save more money or eat healthier? Or even to vote in elections?
Those are all good questions. That's something to think about. But before we go down that rabbit hole, I'm curious about the ethical side of things. Is it okay to use these nudges to influence people's behavior, even if it's for a good cause?
That's a really important question, and it's something that researchers and policymakers are still debating. There's definitely a fine line between giving people helpful guidance and manipulating them.
Right, we don't want to live in a world where everyone is constantly being tricked into doing things they don't want to do, even if it's good for them.
Absolutely. Transparency and informed consent are crucial. And we have to remember that nudges are just one tool among many. They're not a replacement for education or regulation.
Okay, so nudges can be helpful, but we need to use them carefully. Did this study find any negative side effects from the nudges?
Not really. They didn't see any evidence that the nudges backfired in any way. They were effective at boosting tax compliance without causing any harm or backlash.
That's good to hear. So it seems like these behavioral interventions can be a win-win, both for the government and for the people.
Yeah, I think so. It's about finding that balance where you can encourage positive behavior without being too heavy-handed or crossing any ethical lines.
Makes sense. But let's not forget that these nudges were ultimately directed at people, not just at companies. Did they notice any interesting patterns in how people responded?
Yeah, one of the things they found, and this is important, is that the nudges led to a big decrease in the number of firms claiming exempt income levels.
Oh, interesting. So maybe some of these firms were underreporting their earnings before, but not necessarily because they were trying to cheat?
Exactly. It could have been more of a subconscious thing, like they weren't fully aware of the rules or they were just trying to bend them a little bit.
So it's not always about deliberate deception. It's more about human nature.
Yeah, we all have these biases and blind spots, and sometimes we need a little nudge to help us make the right choices.
Okay, so it's not just about catching the bad guys. It's about helping everyone to do the right thing, even in those subtle ways.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the most important lessons from this study. It's about clear communication and setting expectations. When people understand the rules and the consequences of breaking them, they're more likely to comply.
So this research has implications far beyond the Dominican Republic. It suggests that governments everywhere could be using behavioral insights to improve tax compliance and close those loopholes? Right.
That's right. It really makes you wonder if a few subtle changes to a letter can have such a big impact on something as complex as taxes. What else could we use these nudges for?
Yeah, could we encourage people to, like, eat healthier or save more for retirement or be more environmentally friendly? What do you think?
I mean, it's definitely possible this study opens up all kinds of new possibilities for behavioral economics. We're really just scratching the surface here.
It's pretty amazing to think about we could be using these nudges to make the world a better place. But going back to the Dominican Republic study for a second, do we know why these nudges worked so well? What was going on in people's minds?
Well, one thing that seems to be really important is the power of social norms. Like when people are reminded that everyone else is following the rules, they're more likely to do the same.
Ah, so it's like peer pressure.
Kind of, it's more like we all want to fit in and be part of the group, and the public disclosure messages really tapped into that.
How so?
By highlighting the fact that if you get caught evading taxes, everyone's going to know about it, you'll be the odd one out.
Ah, I see. So it's not just about the fear of punishment. It's also about wanting to be seen as a good citizen.
Exactly. And then there's the prison messages. Those seem to work by triggering people's sense of accountability, especially with that commission framing technique.
Right, when you realize that you're not just forgetting to do something, but you're actively choosing not to do it. That can be a powerful motivator.
It is. No one wants to think of themselves as a criminal, even when it comes to something like taxes.
So it's not just about the external consequences, it's about our own internal sense of right and wrong.
Exactly. And that's what makes these nudges so effective. They're not trying to force people to do anything. They're just giving them a little push in the right direction.
And the amazing thing is it seems to work even on big, sophisticated corporations. They may have all the lawyers and accountants in the world, but at the end of the day, they're still run by people, and people are susceptible to these psychological influences.
That's right. We all have these biases and blind spots, no matter how smart or successful we are.
Okay, so what's the takeaway message for our listeners? What should they remember from all of this?
I think the most important thing is to realize that we're not always as rational as we think we are. Our decisions are influenced by all sorts of things that we're not even aware of.
So like our subconscious is playing tricks on us.
In a way. But the good news is that once we understand these influences, we can start to use them to our advantage.
You know, like we could design our own nudges to help us achieve our goals?
Exactly. It's all about becoming more aware of the forces that shape our behavior and then using that knowledge to make better choices.
That's great advice. So next time you're trying to decide something, whether it's big or small, take a moment to think about the nudges that might be at play. Are they helping you or hurting you? And if you don't like the nudges that are out there, you can always create your own. Until next time, keep diving deep.